The pen clicked 3 times. John held the lease renewal tight, feeling the raised ink under his thumb. Across the narrow table, the landlord tapped a clause circled in red. Any unauthorized occupant now triggered a $200 monthly surcharge. The smell of old paper and burnt coffee hung in the air, thick as the silence between them. "Just protocol," the man said, not meeting John's eyes. The clock ticked. Light from the window cut a pale line across the document. John set his key ring beside the water glass, leaving a faint ring of condensation. The door closed behind him with a metallic snap. Outside, a young woman sat on the lobby bench with a frayed duffel bag, unaware that the decision made inside had just altered both their futures. That night, 48 hours of security footage vanished from the building's server. John Mercer stood in the narrow hallway of his apartment building, keys in hand, watching his breath fog in the late October chill that seeped through the cracked window at the end of the corridor. The building manager had called him down an hour earlier, voice clipped and businesslike, saying there were adjustments to discuss. Adjustments always meant money. John had learned that in the 3 years since Rachel left, since the divorce papers arrived with their clean legal language that somehow made the end of a marriage sound like a minor procedural correction. He'd learned it again when his son Danny's school raised fees mid-semester, and again when the car needed new brakes the same week the electricity bill spiked. The manager's office smelled like old carpet and the particular sourness of a space that never quite got enough air. Tom Vickers sat behind a desk that seemed too large for the room, his fingers drumming a rhythm on the lease renewal document. He was a man in his late 50s who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, constantly adjusting it, making sure everyone noticed. "Sit down, John," he said, gesturing to the metal folding chair across from him. The chair scraped against the linoleum. John sat, setting his keys on the edge of the desk. They made a small, definite sound. Vickers slid the document across. "We're updating the lease terms for all tenants," he said, his tone suggesting this was a formality, something beyond discussion. "Building ownership changed hands last month. New policies." John scanned the pages. Most of it was familiar language, the same clauses about maintenance and noise and parking. Then he saw the section circled in red ink. Occupancy rules. Any tenant housing individuals not listed on the original lease will incur an additional monthly fee of $200 per person. No exceptions. The penalty for violation: immediate eviction proceedings. "This is new," John said quietly. Vickers nodded, picking up a pen and clicking it 3 times in quick succession. "It's about liability," he said. "Insurance. You understand." John understood perfectly. He understood that $200 a month was the difference between making rent and not making rent. He understood that no exceptions meant exactly that. He also understood that Vickers knew about Danny, knew that his 8-year-old son stayed with him every other week under the custody arrangement, and that this clause was designed to squeeze people exactly like him. "My son is listed on the lease," John said. Vickers smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Family's fine. I'm talking about strangers, people you might feel charitable toward." The way he said charitable made it sound like a character flaw. John picked up the keys, feeling their weight. 1 key for the apartment, 1 for the mailbox, 1 for the building's side entrance that everyone used because the front door stuck. Small pieces of metal that represented the only stability he'd managed to hold on to. "I'll need to think about it," he said. Vickers' smile faded. "You've got until Friday. Sign or start looking elsewhere." Outside the office, John stood in the lobby, letting his heartbeat slow. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a flat, weary glow. That was when he noticed her. A woman, maybe 30, sitting on the bench near the mailboxes. She had a duffel bag at her feet, the kind with a broken zipper held together by a safety pin. Her coat was too thin for the weather. She wasn't looking at her phone or a magazine. She was just sitting, hands folded in her lap, staring at the elevator doors as if waiting for them to tell her something. John hesitated. Every instinct told him to walk past, to mind his business, to protect the small, fragile space he'd carved out for himself and Danny. But there was something in the way she sat, so still, so quietly desperate, that pulled at him. He'd been that still once, in the weeks after Rachel left, sitting in the apartment at night after Danny was asleep, wondering how he'd gotten to a place where every decision felt like choosing which part of his life to let slip away. He walked over. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up, startled. Her eyes were gray, cautious. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was thin, unconvincing. "Just waiting for someone." John nodded, not pushing. He started toward the elevator, then stopped. "If you need help, there's a shelter 2 blocks east," he said. "They're good people." She didn't respond, just looked down at her hands. John stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, he saw her still sitting there, alone under the fluorescent hum. Upstairs, he unlocked his apartment and set the keys on the kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet. Danny wouldn't be back until Thursday. The lease sat in John's bag, unsigned, a small grenade with a timer counting down. That evening, as he made dinner, he heard footsteps in the hallway, then a soft knock. He opened the door. The woman from the lobby stood there, duffel bag over her shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know where else to go." John looked past her, down the empty hallway, then back at her face. Every practical part of his brain screamed caution. $200, eviction, Danny's stability, but he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. She walked past him, and he closed the door. In the kitchen, the keys sat where he'd left them, catching the last of the daylight from the window, small and bright, and impossibly heavy. Late that night, John couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, looking down at the street, watching a car pass slowly, its headlights cutting through the dark. He thought about the lease, about Vickers' thin smile, about the woman now asleep on his couch under a borrowed blanket. He thought about the security camera in the lobby, the one mounted above the mailboxes, always watching, its red light blinking steadily. He wondered if anyone would check the footage. He wondered what it would show, and he wondered, not for the first time, if doing the right thing and doing the safe thing were ever actually the same. The woman's name was Claire. She told him that the next morning, standing in the kitchen while John made coffee, her hands wrapped around a mug as if it were the only warm thing she'd touched in days. She didn't offer a last name, and John didn't ask. There were protocols for this kind of thing, boundaries that protected both of them. She could stay a few days, he said, until she figured something out. She nodded, eyes down, and he saw relief flicker across her face so quickly he almost missed it. Danny came home Thursday afternoon, dropped off by Rachel's new husband in a car that smelled like leather and expensive cologne. His son ran up the stairs, backpack bouncing, and burst into the apartment with the kind of energy that made the space feel suddenly smaller and infinitely more alive. "Dad!" he shouted, and John caught him in a hug, breathing in the scent of playground dirt and grape juice. When Danny saw Claire, he stopped, curious but not afraid. Kids had a way of reading situations that adults had lost. "Who's that?" he asked. "A friend," John said. "She's staying with us for a little while." Claire smiled, a careful expression. "Hi, Danny," she said. Danny tilted his head, considering, then shrugged and ran to his room to unpack. Crisis averted, for now. But that evening, as John helped Danny with homework at the kitchen table, he caught Claire watching them, her expression unreadable. She looked away quickly, but something about the moment unsettled him. It was the kind of attention that felt like calculation, like someone taking notes. The next day, John found the first anomaly. He'd gone to pay the electric bill online, a monthly ritual he performed with the grim efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much margin for error he had. The amount was wrong, not drastically, but enough to notice. The bill was $43 higher than usual. He pulled up the previous months for comparison. The pattern was consistent until this month. He stared at the screen, trying to figure out what had changed. The only variable was Claire. He didn't want to think it. Didn't want to become the kind of person who helped someone and then immediately suspected them of taking advantage. But the math was there, stubborn and undeniable. 43. He thought about the space heater in the living room, the one he rarely used because it devoured electricity. Had she been using it while he was at work? He walked into the living room. The heater sat in the corner, unplugged, dust on the cord. He checked the bathroom. The light was off, the exhaust fan silent. Everything normal. That evening, while Claire was in the bathroom, John looked through the small notebook she'd left on the coffee table. He told himself he was just glancing, just making sure. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, lists and numbers and abbreviated notes he couldn't quite parse. One page had a series of dates, going back 3 weeks. Another had addresses, none of them familiar. At the bottom of one page, underlined twice, were the words, "Verify timeline." He closed the notebook, guilt settling in his chest like a stone. He was invading her privacy. He was also, he reminded himself, responsible for Danny, for keeping this fragile life intact. The next morning, he found a scrap of paper on the kitchen counter. It was a receipt from a corner store 6 blocks away, dated 2 days earlier, late at night. The purchase, a prepaid phone card. John stared at it. Claire had a phone. He'd seen her use it once, briefly, texting someone before putting it away quickly. Why would she need a prepaid card? He folded the receipt and put it in his pocket, feeling like a detective in a story he didn't want to be part of. At work, he couldn't focus. He was a forklift operator at a logistics warehouse, a job that required attention and consistency, but left his mind free to wander during the repetitive motions. He thought about Claire, about the electric bill, about the notebook and the receipt. He thought about Vickers and the lease, still unsigned, sitting on his kitchen counter like a ticking clock. He thought about Danny, about the careful routine they'd built. Breakfast at 7:15, school drop-off at 8:30, pickup at 3, homework before dinner, bedtime at 8:45. A life held together by precision and routine, and now a stranger in the middle of it, disrupting the balance. When he got home, Claire was cooking. The apartment smelled like garlic and tomatoes, warm and domestic. Danny was at the table, coloring, chattering about something that had happened at recess. Claire laughed at something he said, a genuine sound, and for a moment John felt the suspicion ease. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe the electric bill was a fluke, a meter misread, a billing error. Maybe the notebook was just her way of organizing thoughts. Maybe the receipt was nothing. But that night, after Danny was asleep, John stood in the hallway and listened. Claire was on the phone in the living room, her voice low. He couldn't make out the words, just the cadence, quick and urgent. She was quiet for a long time, listening, then said something short and firm before hanging up. John waited, then walked into the room as if he'd just come from the kitchen. Claire was sitting on the couch, phone in her lap, face neutral. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Fine," she said. "Just checking in with a friend." John wanted to believe her. He wanted to be the kind of person who took people at their word, who didn't dissect every gesture for hidden meaning. But he also wanted to protect his son, to keep the life they'd built from collapsing under the weight of bad decisions and misplaced trust. So he nodded, said goodnight, and went to his room. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, adding up the pieces. The electric bill, the notebook, the receipt, the late-night phone call. Each one alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern, and patterns he'd learned were rarely accident. Saturday morning, John took Danny to the playground 3 blocks away, a small patch of grass and aging equipment, where his son could burn off energy while John sat on a bench and pretended to read the news on his phone. The air was crisp, almost cold, the kind of weather that made everything feel sharper, more defined. Danny ran straight for the swings, and John watched him, feeling the familiar mix of pride and fear that fatherhood had taught him was permanent. "John Mercer, right?" The voice came from beside him. John looked up. A man stood there, maybe 60, wearing a maintenance worker's jacket with the building's logo stitched on the chest. John recognized him vaguely, someone he'd seen in the hallways, nodding hellos, the kind of person who was always around but never quite visible. "Yeah," John said. The man sat down, uninvited but not unwelcome. "Ray Costello," he said. "Building maintenance. Been there 11 years. He didn't offer a handshake, just sat, hands in his pockets, watching the kids play. "I know who you are," Ray said after a moment. "Know your situation, too. Single dad. Custody arrangement. Trying to keep things steady." John stiffened. "That's pretty personal," he said. Ray shrugged. "Small building. People talk. Also, I pay attention. Part of the job." He pulled out a thermos, unscrewed the cap, and poured coffee into the lid. The steam rose between them, smelling like burnt beans and chicory. "You signed Vickers' new lease yet?" Ray asked. John shook his head. "Didn't think so," Ray said. "Smart. That clause is garbage. Legal, maybe, but garbage." John didn't know what to say. Ray sipped his coffee, taking his time. "Here's the thing," Ray said finally. "Vickers is pushing that clause because he wants people out. Building got bought by a development group. They want to renovate, raise rents, bring in new tenants. Your lease is month to month after this renewal. If you don't sign, he can evict. If you do sign and break the clause, he can evict. Either way, you're boxed in." John felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Ray looked at him, his expression steady. "Because I don't like seeing good people get squeezed. And because I know you've got someone staying with you." John's breath caught. Ray held up a hand. "Relax," he said. "I'm not reporting it. But you should know, Vickers has been checking the security footage. He's looking for violations. Anything he can use." John thought about the camera in the lobby, the one above the mailboxes. "How do you know?" he asked. Ray smiled, a small, knowing expression. "Because I'm the one who maintains the system. And because 2 nights ago, someone deleted 48 hours of footage from the server. Not me. Someone with access who didn't want certain comings and goings recorded." John stared at him. "Who?" Ray shrugged. "Don't know. Could be Vickers covering his own tracks. Could be someone else. But here's what I do know. That footage gap lines up with the night your guest arrived. Coincidence? Maybe. But I've been doing this a long time, and I don't believe in coincidences." He poured the coffee back into the thermos, screwed the cap tight. "You're in something, John. I don't know what. But if you need help, I'm around. I see things, hear things. And I've got access to places most people don't." Danny ran over, breathless and grinning, asking for a snack. John pulled a granola bar from his pocket, and his son ran back to the swings. Ray stood, adjusting his jacket. "One more thing," he said. "That electric bill you've been worrying about? Checked the meter this morning. Your usage is normal. The spike was a billing error. Happens sometimes when they update the system. Call them. They'll fix it." John felt a rush of relief, followed immediately by embarrassment. He'd suspected Clara for nothing. "Thanks," he said. Ray nodded. "Don't mention it. Literally. Vickers finds out I'm helping you. I'm gone. But I'll keep an eye out. You need anything? You know where to find me." He walked away, hands in his pockets, Just another maintenance worker on his day off. John sat on the bench, watching Danny play, his mind racing. The electric bill was a mistake. Claire wasn't stealing electricity. But someone had deleted security footage. Someone didn't want a record of her arrival, which meant either she was hiding something or someone else was. John pulled out his phone and opened the browser, typing in the building's management company. He found the contact page, scrolled down, and saw Tom Vickers' name listed as Regional Property Manager. Underneath, in smaller text, previously employed by Gladstone Realty and Urban Housing Solutions. John clicked on Urban Housing Solutions. The company's website was generic, corporate, full of stock photos and vague language about community development and strategic growth. But buried in the About section was a news article from 2 years earlier. Urban Housing Solutions under investigation for tenant harassment and fraudulent eviction practices. The case had been settled out of court, details sealed. John read it twice, then put his phone away. Vickers wasn't just a petty bureaucrat. He was part of a pattern. That evening, after Danny was asleep, John sat with Claire in the living room. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked up from the book she was reading, her expression guarded. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she said, "but not the way you think." John waited. She closed the book, set it aside. "I can't tell you everything," she said. "Not yet, but I will. Soon, I promise." John wanted to push, to demand answers, but something in her voice stopped him. It wasn't evasion. It was exhaustion. "Okay," he said, "but I need to know one thing. Did you delete the security footage?" She looked at him, surprised. "No," she said. "I didn't even know there was footage missing." John believed her, or maybe he just wanted to. Either way, the equation had changed. Someone else was involved, someone with access and motive, and John, whether he liked it or not, was already in the middle of it. Monday afternoon, John left work early, claiming a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. He drove to the public library downtown, a building he hadn't entered in years, all glass and pale wood and the hushed sound of pages turning. He found a computer station in the back, away from the main floor, and logged in. For the next 2 hours, he searched. He started with Claire's first name, adding missing person and the state, then expanding outward. Nothing. He tried witness protection, then fraud case, then domestic violence survivor. Still nothing. He was searching blind, throwing terms into the void and hoping something stuck. Then he tried a different approach. He went back to Urban Housing Solutions, the company Vickers had worked for, and started pulling threads. He found archived news articles, court filings, tenant complaints. A pattern emerged. The company targeted buildings in transitional neighborhoods, bought them cheap, then used aggressive tactics to push out long-term tenants. Harassment, sudden lease changes, strategic neglect of repairs. Once the building was emptied, they renovated and re-leased at triple the rent. It was legal, barely, and devastatingly effective. One article mentioned a whistleblower case. An employee had tried to report the company's practices to the housing authority. The case had been dropped, the employee's name redacted. But in the comments section of an old forum post, someone had written, "They silenced her, but she's still out there. Someone should listen." John stared at the screen. Her. He typed Urban Housing Solutions whistleblower woman and hit search. The results were sparse, most links dead or redirected. But one hit stood out, a legal blog post from 18 months ago discussing the ethics of corporate retaliation. Buried in the middle was a single line. Sources indicate the whistleblower, a former compliance officer, has been in hiding since the case collapsed. John sat back, his heart pounding. Compliance officer. Someone who would have access to records, contracts, internal communications. Someone who could prove fraud. Someone worth silencing. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd taken of Claire's notebook, the page with "Verify Timeline" underlined. Suddenly it made sense. She wasn't hiding from an abusive partner or running from debt. She was gathering evidence, and Vickers, who'd worked for Urban Housing Solutions, knew exactly who she was. When John got home, Claire was at the kitchen table, laptop open, typing with a focused intensity that made her look like someone else entirely. She didn't hear him come in. He stood in the doorway, watching, and for the first time he saw her clearly. Not as a victim, not as a stranger, but as someone fighting a battle with tools most people didn't even know existed. "You're building a case," he said quietly. She looked up, startled, then closed the laptop. "John," she said, but he held up a hand. "You worked for Urban Housing Solutions," he said. "You tried to report them. They buried the case and came after you." She stared at him, her face pale. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter," John said. "What matters is Vickers knows. That's why he changed the lease terms. That's why he's watching. He's trying to force me out so you have nowhere to hide." Claire stood, shaking her head. "I didn't want to involve you," she said. "I thought I could stay a few days, gather what I needed and disappear. But they found me faster than I expected." "Who's they?" John asked. Claire walked to the window, looking out at the street below. "Vickers is just one piece," she said. "There's a lawyer, a city inspector, a few landlords. They're all connected. They've been running this scheme for years, displacing hundreds of families, making millions. I have proof, documents, emails, recorded calls. But I need one more thing. A financial trail. Someone kept records of the cash payments, the off-book deals. I know it exists. I just have to find it." John felt the weight of it settle over him. This wasn't about charity or kindness. This was about justice. Real, hard-edged, dangerous justice. "Where is it?" he asked. Claire turned, meeting his eyes. "I think it's in the building," she said. "Vickers has an office in the basement, behind the maintenance room. Ray mentioned it once, said it was off limits. I think that's where he keeps the records." John thought about Ray, about his offer of help, about the access he had. "We need to get in there," he said. Claire shook her head. "It's too risky. If we're caught, if we do nothing—" "He wins," John said. "He forces me out, you lose your hiding place, and the case dies. Again." Claire looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. John thought about Danny, about the kind of world he wanted his son to grow up in. A world where people couldn't just grind others down because they had more power, more money, more connections. "Because it's right," he said, simply. Claire smiled, a real smile this time, and nodded. "Okay," she said. "Then we do it together." That night, after Danny was asleep, John texted Ray. "Need to talk. Tomorrow morning. Playground." Ray's response came 2 minutes later. "Okay." John set the phone down and looked at the keys on the counter, the same keys he'd been carrying for 3 years. Keys that opened doors, locked them, kept things safe. But safety, he was learning, was an illusion. Sometimes you had to risk everything just to have a chance at something better. He picked up the keys, feeling their weight, and thought about what came next. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be safe. But it was, finally, going to be true. Ray met them at the playground at 6 in the morning, the sky still gray with pre-dawn light. He listened to Claire's story without interrupting, his face unreadable, hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I knew something was off. Didn't know it was this big." He looked at John. "You understand what you're risking, right? If this goes wrong, you lose the apartment. You lose custody. They'll bury you." "I know," John said. Ray nodded slowly. "All right then. Here's what we do." He pulled out a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map of the building's basement. "Vickers' office is here," he said, pointing to a small room behind the boiler. "Only 2 keys exist, his and the building owner's, but there's an access panel in the maintenance room that connects to his office through the ductwork. It's how they ran electrical when they subdivided the space. I can get you in, but you'll have 15 minutes, maybe 20, before the morning shift starts." Claire studied the map. "What about alarms?" Ray shook his head. "No alarms down there. Vickers is arrogant. Doesn't think anyone would dare go into his space." John looked at the map, memorizing the layout. "When?" he asked. Ray checked his watch. "Tonight, midnight. I'll disable the basement hallway cameras from 11:55 to 12:30. After that, you're on your own." He handed John a small flashlight. "Don't use your phone. The light's too bright. And don't touch anything you don't have to. If he notices something's been moved, he'll know." That evening, John made dinner for Danny, helped him with homework, read him 2 chapters of a book about a kid who found a magic treehouse. Normal things, anchoring things. Danny fell asleep at 8:30, and John sat beside his bed for a while, watching him breathe, feeling the enormity of what he was about to do. If this went wrong, he might not get to do this again, not for a long time. The thought made his chest tight, but he didn't let himself spiral. Fear was useful only if it kept you sharp. At 11:45, John and Claire stood in the building's basement hallway. The air smelled like concrete and old oil, the kind of smell that lived in the bones of a building. Ray appeared from the maintenance room, gave them a nod, and pointed to the access panel. It was a metal grate, 2 feet by 2 feet, held in place by screws. Ray had already loosened them. He lifted the grate, revealing a dark tunnel of ductwork. "Straight back, then left," he said. "You'll see light from the office. The panel on the other side is loose. Just push." He handed Claire a pair of gloves. "Prints," he said. Claire went first, crawling into the duct with the flashlight between her teeth. John followed, the space tight and uncomfortable, the metal cold even through his jacket. They moved slowly, quietly, the sound of their breathing loud in the enclosed space. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 2 minutes, Claire stopped. Ahead, a thin line of light marked the edge of another panel. She pushed, and it swung open silently. They climbed out into Vickers' office. It was smaller than John expected, windowless, lit by a single desk lamp someone had left on. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A desk sat in the center, covered with papers and folders. Claire moved immediately to the cabinets, pulling open drawers with practiced efficiency. She scanned labels, flipped through files, her movements quick and certain. John stood by the door, listening, every nerve alive. Minutes passed. Claire pulled out a folder, opened it, and her expression changed. "This is it," she whispered. Inside were spreadsheets, bank statements, handwritten notes detailing cash payments to inspectors, kickbacks to council members, falsified maintenance reports, a complete financial map-étoile of the scheme. Claire pulled out her phone, switched it to camera mode, and started photographing pages. John kept watch, his heart pounding, every sound amplified. A pipe clanged somewhere above them. Footsteps, distant, then gone. Claire worked fast, methodical, capturing every page. 5 minutes, 10. She finished one folder, grabbed another. This one had email printouts, correspondence between Vickers and a lawyer named Hargrove. The language was coded, but the intent was clear. They were coordinating evictions, timing them with property sales, ensuring maximum profit. Claire photographed those too. 2 more minutes, John whispered. Claire nodded, opening a third folder. This one had a list of addresses, buildings across the city, all owned by the same shell companies, all undergoing the same process. displacement, renovation, profit. At the bottom of the list was John's building, with a note. Clear by December 15. Demolition approved. John felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. They were going to tear it down. Everyone who lived there, everyone who'd built a life in those small apartments, would be scattered, and Vickers would walk away richer. Claire finished photographing, closed the folders, and put everything back exactly as she'd found it. They climbed back into the duct, replaced the panel, and crawled out into the maintenance room. Ray was waiting, his face tense. "Took you long enough," he said, but there was relief in his voice. He screwed the grate back into place, checked the hallway, and nodded. "Go, I'll lock up." John and Claire walked quickly to the elevator, stepped inside, and waited until the doors closed before breathing fully again. Upstairs in John's apartment, Claire plugged her phone into her laptop and started uploading the photos. "This is everything," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "This is enough to prove fraud, bribery, conspiracy. It's enough to take them down." John sat at the table, exhaustion washing over him. "What happens now?" he asked. Claire looked at him. "Now I contact the Attorney General's office. I give them the evidence. And we wait." John thought about the keys on the counter, the lease still unsigned, the December deadline. "How long?" he asked. Claire smiled, tired but genuine. "Not long, I promise." Later, after Claire had gone to sleep on the couch, John stood at the window, looking out at the city. The lights stretched endlessly, each one representing someone's life, someone's struggle, someone's small piece of stability. He thought about the security camera footage, the 48 hours that had disappeared. He thought about Vickers and the deleted records and the carefully constructed walls around the truth. And he thought about how sometimes the only way to bring those walls down was to walk through them, even if it meant risking everything on the other side. He picked up the keys from the counter, held them up to the light. Small, ordinary objects. But in the right hands, at the right moment, they could unlock more than doors. They could unlock justice. The community meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, in the building's common room. It was a monthly event, usually sparsely attended, where Vickers presented building updates and tenants nodded along, too tired or too wary to push back. But this month, the room was full. Word had spread. People knew something was happening. They didn't know what, but they felt the tension, the sense that the careful equilibrium they'd all been living under was about to shift. John sat in the back row with Claire beside him. Danny was at Rachel's for the night, a small mercy John was grateful for. Ray stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. Vickers entered at 7:05, carrying a folder and a tablet, his expression confident. He moved to the front of the room, set his materials on the table, and looked out at the crowd. "Good evening," he said. "Let's keep this brief. I know everyone's busy." He launched into his usual presentation. Maintenance updates, policy reminders, a vague mention of upcoming renovations that would improve property value. 20 minutes in, John stood. The room went quiet. Vickers looked at him, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "if you have a question, wait until the end." John didn't sit. "This isn't a question," he said. "It's a statement." He pulled out a printed document, one of the spreadsheets Claire had photographed. "On March 12 of this year, you accepted a payment of $5,000 from Hargrove Legal Group in exchange for expediting eviction proceedings against 3 tenants in this building. The payment was classified as a consulting fee, but the memo line reads, Unit Clearing Incentive. That's fraud." The room erupted. People started talking, some shouting questions, others demanding explanations. Vickers' face went pale, then red. "That's a lie," he said. "You have no proof." Claire stood, holding up her phone. "Actually, we do," she said. "We have bank records, emails, recorded calls, and internal memos. We have a complete paper trail linking you to urban housing solutions and a network of landlords and inspectors engaged in illegal tenant displacement. She looked around the room. Most of you don't know me. My name is Claire Hollis. I worked as a compliance officer for Urban Housing Solutions. I reported their practices. They tried to silence me, but I kept copies, evidence. And now, thanks to Mr. Mercer, we have the final piece. Vickers stepped back, his hand moving toward his phone. You broke into my office, he said. That's illegal. Anything you took is inadmissible. Ray spoke from the back. Actually, the office door was unlocked when I checked it last night during my routine maintenance sweep. Must have been a security oversight. He smiled, a slow, deliberate expression. And if evidence of a crime is discovered in plain sight during a legitimate building inspection, well, that's on you, not us. Vickers turned on Ray, his composure cracking. You're done, he said. You're fired. Pack your things and get out. Ray didn't move. Can't fire me, he said calmly. I don't work for you. I work for the building owner, and I already sent him copies of everything we found, along with my recommendation that he cooperate with the investigation to avoid criminal liability. He agreed. You're the one who should start packing. A woman in the front row stood, holding a piece of paper. I got an eviction notice last month, she said, her voice shaking with anger. It said I violated the lease by having overnight guests, but I live alone. I haven't had a visitor in 6 months. Was that you? Did you make that up to push me out? Vickers didn't answer. Another tenant stood. My rent went up 40% with no explanation. You said it was market rate adjustment. Was that part of this, too? More people stood, stories spilling out, a dam breaking. Each one a small injustice, alone too small to fight, but together forming a pattern too large to ignore. Claire walked to the front of the room, standing beside the table where Vickers had set his materials. She opened her laptop, connected it to the room's projector, and pulled up a document. The spreadsheet appeared on the wall, numbers and names in neat columns. This is the financial record of the scheme, she said. 23 buildings across the city. Over 400 families displaced. Total profit, $11.3 million. Distributed among 7 individuals, including Mr. Vickers, Attorney Hargrove, and 3 city inspectors who falsified safety reports to justify rent increases and evictions. She advanced to the next slide. Email correspondence between Vickers and Hargrove, discussing problem tenants and timeline acceleration. The language was cold, transactional, reducing people's lives to line items on a balance sheet. This email, Claire said, pointing to one dated 3 months earlier, discusses this building specifically. They plan to clear it by mid-December, demolish it in January, and sell the land to a developer for luxury condos. None of you were going to be notified until 30 days before eviction. By then, you'd have no time to fight, no resources to challenge it. Vickers moved toward the door, but Ray blocked his path. You're not going anywhere, Ray said quietly. Police are on their way. Claire contacted them an hour ago. They'll want to talk to you. As if on cue, the sound of sirens filtered through the windows, growing louder. Vickers stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. You don't understand, he said, his voice desperate now. This is how the system works. Everyone does it. I was just following the model. The model is broken, John said, walking to the front. He looked at Claire, then at the crowd of tenants, people he'd lived beside for 3 years, but barely knew. And people like you break it further every time you decide that profit matters more than people. He pulled out the lease renewal, the one with the red circled clause, and held it up. This document was designed to trap me, to make it impossible to help someone without risking everything. You wanted me to choose between being a good person and being safe. But here's what you didn't count on. Sometimes people choose both. Sometimes they find a way. Two police officers entered the room, followed by a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. She introduced herself as Assistant District Attorney Karen Reyes. She'd been copied on Claire's evidence submission that afternoon and had immediately opened an investigation. She looked at Vickers. "Mr. Vickers, I need you to come with us. We have questions regarding financial irregularities and potential fraud charges." Vickers looked around the room, seeing no allies, no escape. He nodded slowly, and the officers escorted him out. The room remained silent until the door closed behind them. Then the silence broke into something else. Not celebration, not yet, but something closer to relief. The woman who'd received the false eviction notice started crying. An older man who'd said nothing all night stood and shook John's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Others echoed it, a quiet wave of gratitude that felt heavier than applause. Claire closed her laptop, her hands shaking slightly. The attorney approached her. "Ms. Hollis, I'll need you to come to my office tomorrow morning. We'll need a formal deposition, and we'll discuss witness protection protocols until the trial concludes." Claire nodded, then looked at John. "I wouldn't have made it without you," she said. John shook his head. "You would have. Maybe not as fast, but you would have." She smiled. "Maybe. But it helps to have someone believe in you when you're not sure you believe in yourself." The attorney handed Claire a business card and left with the officers. The crowd began to disperse, people talking in small groups. The energy in the room shifted from fear to something tentative but real. Hope. Ray walked over to John and Claire. "That was something," he said. He handed John a key, different from the ones he'd been carrying. "Building owner wants to meet with you tomorrow. He's terminating the management contract with Vickers' company. Asked if you'd be interested in joining the new tenant advisory board. Help make sure this doesn't happen again." John took the key, surprised. "What's this?" he asked. Ray smiled. "Storage unit in the basement. Figured you could use the space, on the house." He nodded to both of them and walked out, leaving John and Claire standing in the empty common room. "What happens now?" John asked. Claire looked around the room, at the chairs still arranged in rows, the projector still humming softly, the evidence of what they'd just done still hanging in the air. "Now we testify," she said. "Now the Attorney General builds a case. Now people get justice. Real justice. Not the kind that gets buried in settlements and sealed records." She turned to him. "And you go back to your life. Take care of Danny. Maybe even start to believe that good things can happen." John thought about the keys in his pocket. The old ones, worn smooth from years of use, representing a stability he'd fought to maintain. And the new one, sharp-edged and promising, representing something he hadn't dared imagine. A voice, a role, a chance to shape the space he lived in rather than just survive it. He thought about Danny, about what he'd tell his son when he was old enough to understand, about how sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing, but you do it anyway because the alternative is living in a world where people like Vickers always win. "Thank you," he said to Claire. She shook her head. "I should be thanking you. You risked everything." John smiled. "So did you. Difference is you'd been doing it alone for a long time. Least I could do was stand beside you." They walked out together, into the hallway, past the mailboxes where the security camera blinked its red light, recording everything now. No more gaps, no more deleted footage. Just the truth, preserved and undeniable. Outside, the night air was cold and clean. John looked up at the building, at the windows glowing with life, each one a story he'd helped protect. It wasn't a victory that would make the news or change the world. But it was enough. For now, it was more than enough. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning bright with early winter sun, John stood in the playground with Danny, watching his son navigate the monkey bars with the fearless confidence of 8-year-olds everywhere. Claire had left 5 days earlier, relocated by the district attorney's office to a secure location until the trial. She'd left a note, thanking him again, promising to stay in touch. John had tucked it into the drawer where he kept important papers, another small piece of proof that the previous month had been real. The case against Vickers and his associates had moved quickly once the evidence became public. The local news had run stories. Tenants' rights groups had taken up the cause, and the State Housing Authority had launched a broader investigation into similar schemes across the region. Attorney Hargrove had already accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony. 2 city inspectors had resigned. The building owner, eager to distance himself from the scandal, had offered lease renewals to every tenant at frozen rates for 2 years. No occupancy clauses, no hidden fees, just straightforward agreements that treated people like people. Rachel had called, surprised and a little impressed when she read about it online. "You didn't tell me you were involved in all this," she'd said. "I didn't know if it would work," John had replied. "Didn't want to worry Danny." She'd been quiet for a moment, then said, "He'd be proud of you. When he's old enough to understand, he'll be proud." It was the kindest thing she'd said to him in 3 years, and it mattered more than he expected. Ray had been promoted to building superintendent, a title that came with a small raise and a lot more respect. He'd organized the first tenant advisory board meeting, and John had attended, feeling out of place at first among people who seemed to know more about housing law and community organizing than he did. But they'd listened when he spoke about the practical realities of single parents, about the fear of instability, about how small changes could make enormous differences. By the end of the meeting, he'd been elected vice chair. The responsibility felt heavy, but good, like lifting something that mattered. Danny ran over, breathless and grinning. "Dad, watch this," he said, and ran back to the swings, pumping his legs to gain height. John watched, feeling the familiar mix of pride and protective fear, but underneath it, something new, a sense that the ground beneath them was solid in a way it hadn't been before. Not perfect, not without challenges, but stable, real. A woman approached the bench, someone John vaguely recognized from the building. She had a toddler in a stroller, sleeping peacefully despite the playground noise. "You're John, right?" she asked. He nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "I got the eviction notice last year. False charges, just like the others. I was going to move. Couldn't afford to fight it. But when I heard what you did, I called a legal aid clinic. They're helping me get the eviction removed from my record. Means I can actually apply for better housing now." "That's good," John said. "I'm glad." She smiled. "My kid's going to grow up in a place where people stand up for each other. That matters." She walked away, pushing the stroller toward the shade. John watched her go, thinking about Danny, about the world they were building for him one small decision at a time. It wasn't a fairy tale. The building would still have problems. Money would still be tight. Life would still be complicated. But there was a difference between complicated and impossible, between struggling and being crushed. And that difference, he'd learned, was worth fighting for. His phone buzzed. A text from Clara, routed through a secure number the DA's office had provided. "Trial date set for January 23rd. They're confident. Wanted you to know. And wanted to say again, you changed my life. I won't forget." John typed back, "You changed mine too. Good luck." He put the phone away and stood, walking over to where Danny was now building something in the sandbox with another kid, negotiating the terms of their shared construction with the seriousness of architects. That evening, after Danny was asleep, John stood at the kitchen counter, looking at the keys hanging on the small hook by the door. The old mailbox key, the apartment key, the side entrance key. And beside them, the new key Ray had given him, for the storage unit that symbolized something larger. Space, possibility, a foothold in a system that had tried to push him out. He picked them up, felt their familiar weight, and thought about how objects could change meaning. The same keys that had once represented burden and limitation now felt like tools, like access, like proof that persistence had value. He thought about the security footage that had disappeared the night Claire arrived, the 48 hours that someone had deleted to hide her presence or perhaps to protect her. He still didn't know who'd done it. Maybe Vickers, covering his tracks. Maybe someone else in the building, someone who'd seen more than they let on. Maybe even Ray, though he'd never admit it. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth had come out anyway, that deleted footage couldn't erase reality, only postpone its revelation. John walked to the window, looking down at the street. A car passed slowly, headlights cutting through the dark. Somewhere in the city, Claire was preparing for the trial that would finally validate everything she'd risked. Somewhere, Vickers was probably meeting with lawyers, trying to minimize the damage. Somewhere, hundreds of families were sleeping in apartments they'd almost lost, breathing easier because a few people had decided that justice was worth the risk. He thought about what he'd tell Danny someday, when his son was old enough to ask why they'd stayed in this building, in this neighborhood, when things had been so hard. He'd tell him about Claire, about Ray, about the night they crawled through dustwork to find the truth. He'd tell him that courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about being afraid and acting anyway. He'd tell him that one person could make a difference, but people together could change the system itself. The apartment was quiet, filled with the small sounds of life, the refrigerator humming, the radiator clicking, the distant murmur of neighbors through the walls. John picked up the lease renewal from the counter, the one he'd finally signed last week, the one with fair terms and no hidden traps. He filed it in the drawer with Claire's note, with Danny's school papers, with the business card from the tenant advisory board. Documents that told a story, not of perfection, but of persistence. Not of easy victories, but of earned ones. He returned to the window one last time, keys still in his hand. Tomorrow, he'd go to work, operate the forklift, come home, make dinner, help with homework. The routines that anchored life. But underneath those routines, something had shifted. He was no longer just surviving in the spaces other people controlled. He was shaping those spaces, contributing his voice, his experience, his stubborn belief that people deserved dignity and fairness and a place to call home. The keys caught the light from the street, glinting briefly before he set them back on the counter. Small pieces of metal, ordinary and essential. They locked doors, protected what mattered, kept the world at a manageable distance. But they also opened doors, created access, made connection possible. And in the end, that's what had saved them all. Not the locks, but the willingness to open, to trust, to let someone in when every instinct screamed to protect what little you had. John turned off the kitchen light and walked to his bedroom, leaving the keys where they belonged, ready for tomorrow, ready for whatever came next. The chapter had closed, but the story continued, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, John Mercer was ready to write it himself.